Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening, and welcome to the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C.'s Distinguished Speaker Program. I'm Heidi Shoup, President of the Council, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. In recent weeks, events in Tunisia, and more recently, the ongoing situation unfolding in Tahrir Square in Cairo, have captured America's and most of the world's attention. Much discussion in the media and among policy analysis cadres has focused on America's relationship with the Arab and Muslim world and what all of this means, foretells, implies, and predicts for coming years. Fortunately for us, we had the foresight to have already had scheduled this program with Ambassador Chaz Freeman, to discuss his newest book, Americans' Misadventures in the Middle East. And so tonight, we are very pleased to be able to have him with us to help make sense not only of events unfolding, but to help us wade through the various theories, warnings, celebrations, and certitudes emanating from the media and experts of all description that we hear from on an hour-by-hour basis at this point. Tonight, he will engage in a discussion with Frank Anderson, President of the Middle East Policy Council. Mr. Anderson served the Central Intelligence Agency for 26 years. He served 3 tours of duty in the Middle East, was head of the Afghan Task Force from 1987 to 1989, and was chief of the Near East and South Asia Division. He will introduce Ambassador Freeman. So, without further ado, let's get on with the discussion. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Chaz Freeman and Frank Anderson. Gentlemen.
Thank you all, and especially thank you, Heidi, for the invitation. I'm delighted as another policy wonk to be in the company of those who care about the things we care about. I'm going to introduce now Ambassador Chaz Freeman, and I will slip into Chaz more often than I should, because I've had the honor to have known and worked with Chaz Freeman for some time. Not many of you may know that his distinguished career began in his first tour as a diplomat when he was the interpreter for Richard Nixon, when Nixon made his famous initial trip to China. That career went on with Chaz advancing to be the Director of Chinese Affairs at the Department of State, a principal deputy in the Bureau of African Affairs, and to be the United States ambassador in Saudi Arabia at a critical time. 1990 and 1991, we'll all recall the years that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, had to be expelled, and being in Saudi Arabia not only put Ambassador Freeman at the forefront of the task of putting together the coalition to expel the Iraqis from Kuwait, but it actually put him in the line of fire. Subsequently, he was appointed by President Clinton to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, and upon leaving the government, did what many of us do, went into business, where he is a very successful President and Director of the Asia Projects Group, and to replace Senator George McGovern as President of the Middle East Policy Council. I have the good fortune to, not to try to fill his shoes because I can't, but to stand upon his shoulders in that role in the council. Ambassador Freeman has certainly spoken widely and written widely on America's adventures and misadventures in foreign policy. His 3 books, Arts of Power, Statecraft, and Diplomacy, which first came out in 1997, The Diplomat's Dictionary, which was just revised in 2010, and the latest, America's Misadventures in the Middle East in 2010, are valuable additions to the dialogue. Tonight we're here to have a discussion based upon the book, or at least centered upon the book. And allow me to be crass about this. Everybody please buy the book. It's an outstanding piece of very important reflections that Chaz wrote or spoke really over the last decade on our policies. And when you consider, I'd say the last 2 decades, because the period which concerns us comes from the end of the Cold War, a moment of great victory for the United States and for the free world, and a point at which we stood ready to make great advances on, well, standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. And frankly, America's performance in diplomacy and statecraft in these intervening 20 years has been disappointing. The nation that went in 5 years from being attacked at Pearl Harbor to creating the jet age and the atomic age, defeating 2 world fascist powers, and then setting up the United Nations and a system that was a little perturbed for 50 years trying to deal with the Soviet Union, but in the end accomplished that task, has not dealt well with the challenges of the last 10 years. And Chaz's book goes into the reasons we have done so. Tonight, Chaz will open with his remarks, and then we will get into an exchange, but very quickly I hope to turn it over to questions and answers, because just casting out, I see some familiar and respected faces in the audience. I'm certain that your questions will be more interesting than mine. With that, I will turn it over to Chaz to give his view of why he wrote that book and where we are today.
Well, thank you, Frank. I wrote this book in the form of a series of articles, many of them not published, and speeches which were made public, because I was deeply disturbed by the course of American policy in the Middle East over this post-Cold War era. I should say that although I began my career in the Foreign Service in India and was tempted to learn Persian, instead learned Tamil, which I've blessedly forgotten, I considered avoiding the Middle East my greatest diplomatic achievement for quite a long while. And when I was called in Maputo, Mozambique, and asked by George H.W. Bush to be ambassador to Saudi Arabia, he assured me, perhaps detecting that I wasn't terribly enthusiastic, that nothing ever happened there. That was one of the few things he got wrong, I think. And I watched a series of misadventures, risks that we took, judgments we made which turned out to be wrong. And I'm sorry to say that the misadventures very much continue. It's not just the gripping scenes in Tahrir Square in Cairo that I'm talking about, but remember that as we speak, we are in the process, as I speak, we are in the process of contriving a withdrawal from Iraq, a country that we have left in ruins, riven by religious strife, and about whose strategic orientation we are entirely uncertain. Will it be an adjunct of Iranian power in the Middle East, or as it was traditionally, a return to a balancing of Iran? We don't know. Will it enjoy domestic tranquility or sink again into a high level of civil strife that is destabilizing not just for itself but everyone in the region? Let's not forget, we managed to drive 20% of Iraqis from their homes. 10% of them remain in exile abroad. This happens to be the best educated technocratic class of Iraq. So Iraq is not only a misadventure, but a source of great uncertainty. Afghanistan, no one can explain what we're trying to do there. Although, again, we seem to be withdrawing, there are no clear criteria by which we can measure the pace of that withdrawal, and the pacification effort we've undertaken does not appear to be succeeding. America appears to be creating more terrorists than we are eliminating. The issue of Iran, which has hung over the United States and the region for 30 years since the Islamic Revolution, first removed Iran as our regional gendarme in the region, as we used to call it, and made it an implacable enemy of the United States, remains unresolved. We have not found a basis for any sort of diplomatic dialogue with Iran. Don't believe those who say we've tried diplomacy and it's failed. We haven't been able to conduct diplomacy, as much for reasons of schizophrenia at home as because of schizophrenia in Tehran. Israel-Palestine issue. There's been no peace process for over a decade, although there have been farcical attempts to pretend that there was one. And now, of course, with the events in Egypt, we are reminded of the texts of the Camp David Accords, and if you actually go back and read those, you will be stunned to discover that they open with an affirmation by both sides, including Israel, of the sanctity of Resolution 242, by which Israel was to withdraw from all of the occupied territories, and 338, which affirmed 242, among other things. The initial part of Camp David is an elaborate set of scenarios for the removal of the occupation and the achievement of Palestinian self-determination, culminating in a referendum. None of this has been implemented. It is therefore not a little ironic that Mr. Netanyahu should insist that whatever follows the Mubarak regime in Egypt must be committed to implementing the Camp David Accords, since they have not been implemented on the other side. Finally, one has a sense that history is moving in important directions in the region as a whole. This is the one region of the world where a great civilization, that of the Arabs and Persia, has failed to find renewal and vigor. One looks at China, at India, reasserting themselves, Japan in an earlier era, and yet somehow the mixture of fatalism, fatalistic acceptance of the present, and an obsequious deference to foreign powers in the region has left it in a kind of neo-colonial position. If the Iranian Revolution was a break from that, it ended by isolating Iran, not spreading in the region. One has the sense, however, that the events in Tunis and Egypt represent a moment when the Arabs are standing up, setting aside their fatalism, developing a bit of optimism about the future, and trying to seize control of their own destiny in a way that they have never, since European colonialism arrived, been able to do.
Chess, when you attended a similar event at the at Steve Clements Center, I think about 10 days ago, he made the point that as he interacts with senior military and diplomatic officials of the United States, senior staffers and members from Congress, there's very little disagreement about the poor state, and in fact, frequently, very little disagreement about the kinds of strategies that we ought to be implementing, yet we are structurally incapable of doing that. Well, I won't ask any further, but what would you say is the diagnosis, prognosis, and prescription for that situation where we seem unable to formulate and carry out a policy?
The system is broken. We have not really tried to fix it. Why is that? And why is it that we have abandoned something we all know from our daily lives, which is that the most effective means of influencing people is not to give them a cold shoulder or the finger or yell at them, but to discuss soberly with them what it is that they are doing that damages their own interests or offends their own sense of morality and therefore should be corrected. Why can't we do these things? I think, in effect, this gets back to a sense that many of us have. The Tea Party has it. Those on the left have it. That there is something fundamentally broken in our political system at home. Let me try to connect that to your question. We now believe, apparently, that the national interest is equivalent to the sum of the special interests. What happens when a president or a political leader puts forward a strategic vision is that that vision is immediately disaggregated, dissected, divided up, and distributed to many particular interests for minute examination in terms of their parochial interests and without regard to the interests of other interest groups. So a strategy is immediately broken down to the tactical level and re-examined on that level. And even those who agree look at their little piece of this broken puzzle, and if they agree with that, think, how can I bargain with this? So at best, if things come back together, what began as a coherent vision is now an incoherent assembly of many little pieces, each reflecting a particular interest. I have some theories about why that occurred, but I don't think that is an unfair description of our political system today. And it makes the development of strategy impossible, whether it is in the domestic sphere with health insurance reform or financial reform, or whether it is in the international sphere with climate change or Middle East peace or an approach to the challenge of Islamic extremism. Why the lack of diplomacy? Simply put, the United States has spent the last 60 years developing what President Eisenhower correctly warned against, a vast military-industrial complex. We have spent trillions of dollars to develop theories and means of coercing others to our will. We have spent nickels and dimes, if that, on studying how to persuade others to respond to their own interests and common values, non-coercive measures, which is what diplomacy is all about. And I would add that all these things come together because in the Cold War, a very brilliant diplomat, George Kennan, 1946, wrote something that became known as the long telegram from Moscow, the long cable. In 1947, that proposal became enshrined in the doctrine of containment, which was a grand strategy, which incorporated political, economic, cultural, informational, and military means in one great package intended to do something that it eventually achieved, namely to wall off the Soviet Union until the defects and the inadequacies of its own system brought it down. We didn't win the Cold War, they lost. we were left standing. We won by default, which is an important point, actually, in many contexts. But Kennan's strategy, pursued diplomatically, economically, informationally, and militarily, increasingly militarily over the course of the strategy, achieved exactly what he thought it would. It enabled the Soviet Union to collapse of its own infirmities. And so we didn't have to do strategy for 45 years. It was there. It was written. We didn't have to think. And we sort of forgot how to think about strategy. And we began to imagine that the answer to every problem is to apply sanctions, and when they fail, as they always do, send in the bombers and the Marines. And in the post-Cold War era, that has turned out to be a recipe for disaster.
A year ago, I was in Chicago, and in a breakfast discussion with a just recently retired Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, and mentioned that I was about to leave Chicago to go to Connecticut to talk to a senior men's group, and was struggling with what the subject was going to be, and I had decided to talk about, again, the comparison of American success in the 20th century to a pretty stumbling start with the 21st century. And without much thought, what he blurted out was an important line that I would like you to expand on, and that was, you know, we used to be a force to be reckoned with and a friend upon whom to be relied. We've become a problem to be managed. Just very quickly, from your experience with China, multiple experiences able to talk about the European Union and the states of the Middle East, who's doing well at managing us and who's doing poorly?
Well, some people are doing very well at managing their own affairs. China is at the top of that list. A far bigger stimulus package in response to the financial crisis proportionally than the United States mounted, 95% of it consisting of investment in the future, meaning investment in human and physical infrastructure, much of which the President referred to in his State of the Union message. China's investing in becoming more competitive and economically efficient. Most of the American stimulus package was devoted to plus-ups in subsidies for consumption and tax breaks and the like, with very small amounts devoted to a few projects related to high-speed rail or environmental efficiency and the like. China's doing well managing itself. So is Brazil, apparently. So is India, far better than before. And so are, generally speaking, the Arab societies of the Persian Gulf. Europe, after, you know, I hate to say complimentary things about Europe because if you ever are so unfortunate as to be at a European gathering, sometimes you feel that you would rather put your head in the oven and turn on the gas than continue to listen to explorations of the European identity of the future or whatever. Russia is not doing terribly well, and there are others who are clearly not doing well, but we're fairly close to the top of the list of those with serious problems. We have a chronic balance of payments and budget deficit. We have failing pension systems. We have a health system which costs more and delivers less than any other such system in the industrial democracies, which helped to bankrupt General Motors, and which is a big factor in our loss of international competitiveness. We have an educational system which educates kids to mediocrity while convincing them that they're excellent. We have a series, in other words, we have quite a range of structural problems. To me, those are summed up in some figures, which are pretty dramatic. The total revenue of the federal government in 2010 from all sources, income tax, individual, corporate, excise tax, tariffs, Medicare, Medicaid taxes, Social Security, everything, was $2.2 trillion. Total federal government transfer payments to individuals in 2010, meaning unemployment, Medicare, Medicaid, pension, Social Security, all of that package, $2.4 trillion. Before we even did anything to run our government, we had to borrow $200 billion. To pay for our wars, to run the government, everything in the government, from what Mark Twain correctly called the closest thing to an American native criminal class, namely the U.S. Congress, to the executive branch in all its splendor, we have to borrow $1.3 trillion. So we take in $2.2 trillion, we spend $3.7 trillion. Most of the $1.3 trillion we borrow for government operations, by the way, is military related. And nobody's got a plan for balancing the books. If you look at what is being discussed, it's trivial in relation to the size of these problems. So it's my contention that not only have we been not doing terribly well in places like the Middle East, but we are going to be forced by the very fiscal hollowness of our military to curtail, trim back, redefine the foreign policy objectives that we have adopted in the post-Cold War era, because we cannot afford to pursue these objectives in the manner in which we have done. And the final point here is that there's an old adage, which I think applies to our country and gives me hope for our rediscovery of diplomacy, and that is that those who can't live by their wallets have to learn to live by their wits. There are a lot of clever people in this country who have not been exercising their brains very much about how to deal with the world outside our borders. They've been content to leave that to people with guns. And I think one way or another, those people with brains, with wits, are going to be called upon, and I'm confident will respond. And we will restore a better, more productive, less self-destructive relationship with the rest of the world, including the Middle East, which I think is what we were here tonight to talk about, and we've gotten off on quite a number of other topics.
Well, let's go back to the Middle East and to very current events. George Freeman from Stratford, I just noted a paper that he put out on Egypt and its relationship with Israel. And George, whose writings are frequently concerned with the welfare of Israel, pointed out that until 1978, Egypt was an existential threat to Israel. Immediately upon Sadat's visit and the subsequent Egyptian-Israeli peace treaties, Israel no longer had an existential threat from any other power. It was dealing with unconventional warfare in Lebanon and counterterrorism. He made the point that if something should happen, a change, a real change, a revolution in Egypt, and certainly the platform of the Muslim Brotherhood and many of the youth who are in the streets demonstrating in Egypt calls upon abrogation of that treaty, Israel is confronted by something that would make, in his words, the adjustment of the borders with Palestine a minor issue. What's your view of the likely events in the coming 6 months?
Well, it's much easier to tell people what's going to happen in 40 years than in the next 6 months.
Give it 6 years.
Yeah. I think Mr. Freeman has made an important observation. That is, for 30 years, the United States essentially bought security for Israel by keeping Egypt and later Jordan in the framework of the Camp David Accords, despite the fact that, as I indicated at the outset, those accords were not implemented by Israel except in terms of the withdrawal from Sinai. Everything else was finessed, and therefore Israel failed to achieve the normalization of relations with Egypt and others that it could have done. That is to say, the Camp David Accords could have been accepted as a legitimate basis for coexistence with Israel in the region. They weren't. Egypt was kept in that framework by American taxpayer dollars and weaponry. Now, I think it's very important to understand that the revolution in Egypt is not about Israel. It's not about the United States. It's not about abrogating the Camp David Accords, and it's not about even setting them aside in some less dramatic fashion. But it's very clear, 82% of Egyptians, according to the latest polling data, have an extremely negative view of the United States. I believe almost 100% have such a view of Israel. The Camp David Accords are very unpopular, and it's very clear that if there is a somewhat more democratic regime in Egypt that emerges from all of this, it's going to be far less inclined to heed American advice or to dance to the tune of the American piper than the Mubarak regime has been. I don't think Egyptians, and especially the Egyptian army, want to return to a state of war with Israel. But Israel is now confronting the true existential challenge that it has always avoided looking at, which is that you cannot exist in a neighborhood like the Middle East or anywhere else at daggers drawn with all your neighbors. Israel has had 60-odd years to build friendships in the region. It has done nothing. It has no friends in the region, none. And while there have been offers, as in 2002 at Beirut, by the entire Arab world and the Islamic world later through the organization of the Islamic Conference, to normalize relations with Israel completely, if only Israel would reach some mutually acceptable agreement and modus vivendi with the Palestinians. Israel has not done that. On the contrary, it's continued to prefer land to peace and not to offer self-determination to the Palestinians. So this danger of a collapse of the Camp David framework, maybe a slow collapse, maybe a setting aside of it, maybe simply an end to acquiescence in some things that have been acquiesced in by Egypt and others. This brings Israel up against the real challenge to its long-term existence, which is whether it can find acceptance in the Middle East. And it cannot find acceptance through F-16s dropping bombs in Gaza or the other methods that have been followed. So I think it's a major challenge to Israelis to rethink their approach to their own consolidation of their state and its relations with others. One hears in the Arab world, when one travels there, more and more echoes of Israel is just another crusader kingdom. We've had these before, foreign implants in our region, which, having failed to establish relations of mutual respect with others here, in time succumb to the stress and the security challenges that perpetual warfare and enmity create. Israel needs peace. The United States needs peace in the Middle East. God knows the Palestinians need peace. The Arabs have offered peace and want it, but there has been no peace process, as I said, for more than a decade.
Our last Middle East Middle East Policy Council conference on Capitol Hill, the subject was Arab-Israeli or Israeli-Palestinian developments, and let me summarize the argument that goes: the United States has a strategic interest, more than a strategic interest. We are confronted by a strategic threat in the absence of a settlement of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The following is my view, and I just posit it, but I'm not worried about it, and that is that what the two sides have proven is that they are unable to make a deal. Now, we can argue about why, we can argue about whether it's one side's fault or the other, but what's been demonstrated now is that neither the Palestinian side nor the Israeli side can make a deal. Their political processes give the rejectionist minorities in both societies a veto. We have a strategic problem. They can't deliver it. A solution, I will posit the following, that is, therefore, the argument that we can't want peace more than the parties want peace, or that we, of course, have to accept what the parties negotiate between themselves, is demonstrably unsupportable. We need peace. They don't want it enough to make it. You made a comment in your discussion with Steve Clemens that perhaps because we have disqualified ourselves, is the term I think you said, as a broker, that we need to outsource it. What are the prospects for some combination of international forces, and I don't mean doing it by force, international powers and players, to take this festering sore of a conflict and come up with a solution?
Well, I think it's not hard to understand why there has been no peace. Israel has had everything going its way without peace. We have a blank check which deprives Israelis of incentives to do anything other than what they have been doing. Palestinians, for their part, have been, partly as a result of Israeli and American efforts, severely divided to the point where there is no one who can sign an agreement with authority on the Palestinian side. I mean, it's totally absurd that you exclude the elected government from the elections of 2006 from a deal. Whether you like them or not is not the point. If you want to have an agreement with anybody, you've got to have people with the authority to commit their side, and there is no one at the moment on the Palestinian side who can do that. The notion that Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, could do this for the Palestinians after he lost an election and exceeded his constitutional term of office, has very limited popularity, was absurd at the outset, and it's even more absurd now that the Palestine Papers have been released, and one can see how desperate the Palestinian negotiators for Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah were for a deal with the Israelis, to the point where they went far beyond what anybody had understood in accommodating Israeli demands, only to be met with a situation where Israel would not take yes for an answer. So this is a pretty bad situation. There are obvious ways of dealing with it. You have to find a way of restoring Palestinian unity so that there's someone who can actually do a deal, and you have to deprive Israel of the backing that enables it to avoid decisions. Same principle as not giving money to an alcoholic so that they can go to the liquor store and buy more drink. Enablement is what it is called. So you have to end the enablement on, it's not putting pressure on Israel, you just have to end the enablement. And just as it is not a kindness to feed the habit of an alcoholic, it's not a kindness to Israel or to its inhabitants to facilitate their self-destructive behavior. So how could this be outsourced? Well, in a sense, there are efforts being made to do that. The United Nations has been totally ineffective in this area because of U.S. vetoes. We've cast 47 on behalf of Israel. We have avoided casting many more by threatening to cast vetoes and invalidating processes. And the UN, which was created to enforce the Charter and international law, has in fact become the principal mechanism for suspending the operation of the Charter and international law in the Middle East. So it may be somewhat out of the question that the Palestinian effort at the moment to invoke the UN in condemning the illegal settlement activity that continues should be proposed. The Palestinians are proposing such a thing. It's widely expected that the United States will veto once again. I don't know whether that's the case or not. But this gets us to several other alternatives. I think the international community is virtually united on this issue. When votes come up in the UN, the United States and Israel, together with the Marshall Islands and Palau, those mighty powers in the Pacific, are generally the only ones who vote against proposals. Sometimes others join, but it's always a very small minority. So the international community as a whole seems to be prepared to act if they can find a way to do it. There are several methods. One is to go to the General Assembly with a Uniting for Peace resolution similar to the one that authorized U.S. intervention in Korea against the North Korean attack. That is, having found that the Security Council was incompetent to handle the issue, the international community went beyond the Security Council. That's one way. Another way would be to work outside the UN context. There's nothing to stop other countries from calling an international conference and drawing their own policies up, which have the effect of strengthening the Palestinian bargaining position, helping the Palestinians to make common cause with the Arab peace proposal, backing the Arab peace proposal, and at the same time putting significant pressure on Israel, showing it that it cannot in the long run continue to defy international law in the manner it has with impunity. Is there a mighty superpower out there that could take on the role of the United States? No. The United States remains not only the only country that can, on its own, produce a solution in the Middle East, but the only country that can prevent a solution in the Middle East, which is, I think, a fair description of much of what we have been doing for the last 20 years.
I think it's now time to turn over to, as I said, more experienced, smarter, and some friendly faces in the audience. And it's your turn, ladies and gentlemen, and I see a hand.
Ambassador Freeman, welcome. My name is Daniel Robinson, and I actually had a question about what do you see China's role as an ascending power in the Middle East?
Essentially, the Chinese globally are following policies which are very reminiscent of those that we followed in the early days of our republic. Friendship and commerce with all, and non-interference in internal affairs to avoid being dragged into the quarrels of others. And they're doing it, I suppose, for the same reason that Jefferson advocated this approach, namely they're both relatively weak compared to other powers like ourselves, and they are focused on domestic development of their own economy and building their own society. As they put it, they need a peaceful international environment for their own purposes. So in the Middle East, China has been remarkably successful in not making enemies. It's on excellent terms with Israel. It's also on very good terms with the Palestinians. It has a strong relationship with Egypt. It has a good relationship with Iran. It has a fair and improving relationship with Turkey. That is the most troubled relationship of all because of the Turkic-speaking Uyghur community in Xinjiang and the strong support among Turks in Turkey for that minority. It has an excellent and growing relationship with Saudi Arabia and the other states in the Gulf. In fact, there are now something over 200,000 Chinese living and working in the Gulf, and China's become the largest trading partner of most of those countries, displacing the United States from that position. I don't think there's much reason to fear that the Chinese are going to throw their military weight around in the region. First, they don't have any to throw because they do not have a power projection capability and will not have one for many decades, if ever. Despite the convenient label we put on them that they are a peer competitor, there's no evidence that they intend to become such. In fact, as I remarked 10 days ago when asked a related question, our greatest fear about China seems to be that they will become like us, that they will develop an ideology that they insist everyone else conform to, that they will promiscuously intervene militarily throughout the globe, that they will avoid approaches based on persuasion and adopt coercive measures similar to the ones we do. But to date, that has not been the case. In fact, we have some very odd situations. In the Middle East, for a variety of reasons, we invariably protect Israel from the consequences of its own misbehavior and self-destructive behavior. We protect them in the UN, we protect them financially, we protect them militarily, and they can do no wrong in our eyes, apparently. China seems to have the same sort of relationship with North Korea. North Korea may be China's Israel, which it protects against its own stupid, self-destructive activities, and which it keeps going despite the fact that North Korea is equally detested by all its neighbors as Israel is by its. But a final point is that there is a genuine philosophical difference between us and China on the appropriate approach to influence internationally, which goes back to the point the previous questioner put about our propensity to smash things up as a means of getting our way. We have a difference of opinion on how to persuade Iran to do things our way. You know, our approach to Iran we have a 5-part message we've delivered. You can contemplate, if you were on the receiving end of this message, whether you would find it persuasive or not. But our message is, 1, you are evil, which is a great way to start a conversation. 2, we're not going to talk to you until you come out with your hands up. Number 3, we're going to overthrow your regime, and if you don't believe it, look at the $75 million we've appropriated to accomplish that. And number 4, if you don't cooperate with the diplomacy I have just outlined, we may bomb you. And number 5, if you try to develop a deterrent to our bombing you, we will certainly bomb you, and possibly with nuclear weapons. Well, I have some problems with that particular approach. And apparently the Chinese and some others do too, quite aside from the fact that on the one hand we lament high prices at the gasoline pump, and on the other hand we try to cut Iran off from producing oil. I mean, there are lots of contradictions here. But with regard to China, I think my experience with the Chinese is that you can very often elicit their help in pursuing a course of action if you don't insist that they have to do it our way. Allow them to do it their way.
Abraham Abidor, retired from the Foreign Ex-Service. Yeah, I just wanted to thank you very much for your informative and thoughtful presentation, and would like you perhaps to comment on what can be done to improve the prospects for peace and stability and prosperity in the Arab world, aside from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which you articulated so well. Over there, we have problems with youth unemployment and Islamic revolution in Iran, the prospects for civil war, as you correctly pointed out, in Iraq, unreal borders drawn by Sykes-Picot Agreement in 1926 in Europe, which caused some border problems, lack of rainfall, resource constraint with the Nile, that's only on the Suez Canal, which provide livelihood for maybe 20, 30 million people, not 85 or 90 million. A lot of problems in the Middle East, aside from the Israeli-Palestinian. Any thoughts on how these could be resolved, alleviated? Thank you.
Well, I think you're quite correct to point out, implicitly at least, that were we to, by some miracle, actually find a means of promoting reconciliation and mutual respect between Israelis and Palestinians and Israel and its other Arab neighbors, that wouldn't solve all of the problems of the region by any means. Islam would still have a crisis within itself. The issues of the Arab world coming more to grips with the requirements of modernity would still be there. And there would still be problems of misgovernance in the Arab world that are totally unrelated to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I suppose the answer to the question of what can and must be done, first of all, we have to recognize that while the term Arab world is in fact descriptive of a reality, Arabs resemble Americans in the sense that they are defined by a common set of language, culture, not by physical appearance. Arabs come in every shape and color and hair texture and height and waist that you can imagine. So in that sense too, they resemble Americans. It's not a racial group. It's not an ethnic group. It's a cultural region, and in that cultural region there are societies that are quite as different as Sharecropper, Mississippi, and Sarah Palin's Alaska, if that exists. So there is no cookie-cutter approach to all of this. The oil-rich countries of the Persian Gulf do have some things in common with Mauritania, but not many. So renewal has to come on many levels and in many different formulas. And I think part of the difficulty is that in places like Saudi Arabia, there appears to be very little functional discontent. There are arguments. Obviously, Saudi Arabia has exported some of those arguments in the form of terrorists, but Saudis don't emigrate. They come here and study and they go home. They're the only group in the world that does that. You don't find people leaving that place. Why? Because it's a total welfare state, because family ties and tribal ties are so important, many reasons. So I think we have to also recognize that the sources of discontent are different in each place and require different answers. It would be the requirements for renewal. One of them I referred to, symbolized by Kaust. That is that Islam needs to go through its enlightenment period, which it has not done. It needs to find a new footing based on returning to its roots. A second requirement is that, as happened in the West, in both Judaism and Christianity, the relationship between man and God and between man and work needs to be redefined. Third, there needs to be more assertiveness on the part of a populace that has been far too passive and fatalistic. And that seems to be happening in Egypt and Tunis and maybe more broadly. And I'm hopeful, not over my lifetime, perhaps not even yours, we will see visible progress made toward juster, more prosperous, more effective societies in the Arab world than we currently have.
It was a comprehensive question that yielded a comprehensive answer that I think is a really good point to close this down. And our president is standing telling me that it is time to do so. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Thank you for your questions, and thank you, Chaz, for your answers and your time. And ladies and gentlemen, let me once again say the book is available in the back at a very reasonable price. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.